My name is Darrell Arnold. I'm interim dean of Biscayne College at St. Thomas University and an associate professor of philosophy. My favorite thinking space really depends on what you call thinking. This is always a very difficult question in the Western philosophical tradition. Any cognitive act, on the one hand, could be considered thinking. If you take and bite into an apple and you taste the savoriness of the apple, the sweetness of the apple, you're having some kind of thought. Now, this highlights one of the dimensions of thinking, and that is that it's very often considered private. Somebody biting into the apple and tasting the sweet apple is having an experience that somebody else doesn't know precisely in the same way. Another kind of thinking is an abstract thought, some kind of discursive thinking, where you do a calculation or you theorize or something like that. Again, individuals are having cognitive acts at all times. What philosophers want to honor as thinking differs in the Western tradition. A lot of my thinking is thinking with books. So this highlights some kind of an interesting contrast between the privateness of the act of thinking and the collectiveness of a library, for example, where I do a lot of this kind of a thinking. What I often want is to have access to the words of other people who I've already read before. I can open up the books and I can think with the people who have written these books. And the paradox that this highlights is that it's an individual act, it's a private act of thought, but it's a private act of thought that I can have because of becoming a part of a society that teaches me a particular language, a society that has a learning community. So I internalize through exposure to these words and then these ideas which I can then privately think. A library space for academic work is wonderful because I'm able to go out, as I said, and grab those books and precisely quote them, write about them. Increasingly today, you might turn from books to some electronic media. I have a hard time thinking an academic paper through today without an internet connection to get me all sorts of precise details that I only foggily remember in my memory, but that are there accessible to me through a Google search or something like that. So within the Western tradition, there's this long discussion about what thinking is and what the best type of thinking is. On the one hand, there are those people who emphasize that only discursive thinking is really thinking. On the other hand, there are those who say the real kind of thinking happens when we shut off discursive processes. The Taoists or the Buddhists might say what we need to have real thinking, thinking that unveils being, or we build a Heidegger in the Western philosophical tradition, is a thinking that is non-discursive. And so the kind of environment you would want for that kind of thinking is different than the kind of environment that you would want for a discursive project like writing a paper. Now, collectively, the kind of thinking we do then varies as well. Collectively, you might think of a church as a place for a certain kind of thinking, a certain kind of contemplative thinking together. Various people are sometimes afraid that that type of thinking actually shuts off thinking processes, that it's not real thinking, that it subjects individuals to an authority, to a herd mentality. But I think that that's not all that it does, and it has potentialities for some other kinds of things. Another way of collectively thinking is in a discussion with individuals. You see this in Plato's dialogues, all of this discussion, where in a public forum, people are discussing what justice is or what beauty is. And it's through this interaction in a public sphere that they are able to come to some conclusion. Individuals see that others have insights that they haven't had, and they bow to reason in the discussion, eventually reaching a conclusion that individuals all can agree upon. So we can set up social spaces in a way to facilitate this kind of dialogue. My own view is that discursive spaces like this are best, I would even give you some specific details, with a round table rather than a long rectangular one that establishes hierarchies. For discursive spaces, I think you want active engagement, you want active participation of all individuals without coercion, and there's a way of setting up a public space for discourses of that nature, and there's a way of setting them up so that they're more hierarchical and would interfere with discursive thought.